In the vast Pacific theater of World War II, few moments carried the mix of secrecy, precision, and cold inevitability as the operation that led to the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The story begins not with a battle, but with a message. One radio transmission sent with confidence, encrypted according to Japanese military standards, and never expected to fall into enemy hands. It was a message that detailed times, locations, escorts, intentions. It was routine as any high-level inspection tour might be in wartime. Yet it would become the most fatal itinerary ever written. And the circumstances that led to its interception and the decision to act upon it reveal a fascinating intersection of intelligence work, military daring, and moral complexity. This is the unfolding of a moment when the war in the Pacific became not only a clash of armies, but a duel of invisible minds, codebreakers deciphering the path of a man whose strategic brilliance had shaped the conflict from the very beginning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was already a figure carved into the American consciousness by the time 1943 arrived. To the Japanese Empire, he was the master strategist. To the United States, he was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the name behind the shock and devastation of December 7, 1941. Behind closed doors, Yamamoto had his doubts about a long war with America. He understood the industrial might of the United States and feared the long-term consequences of waking a giant. Still, he planned the Pearl Harbor attack with precision, hoping that a crippling blow would force the United States into negotiation rather than total war. Instead, America doubled its resolve. Battles raged across the Pacific, and 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the conflict had shifted. The U.S. had learned, it had adapted, and, most importantly, it had begun breaking the codes that once concealed Japan's movements. The American cryptologists stationed at Pearl Harbor, known as Station Hypo, had been grinding for months. Led by the brilliant Joseph Rochefort, the team had cracked Japan's primary naval code, JN-25. It was not an effortless breakthrough. It demanded endless nights of analysis, statistical guesses, reconstructing patterns from partial intercepts. The work was so tedious that even those involved struggled to describe it. It was neither glamorous nor straightforward. It was more like assembling an enormous puzzle with most pieces missing and no picture on the box. But slowly, the American team gained fluency. They began pulling meaning out of the coded chaos, phrases that hinted at enemy dispositions, ship movements, convoy schedules. By mid-1942, their success had already helped the U.S. win the Battle of Midway. But in April 1943, the pieces that fell into their hands belonged to something different, something extraordinary. An ongoing Japanese message came through the airwaves. Its tone was matter-of-fact. It contained codes already familiar to American analysts. As the cryptologists decrypted it, one detail at a time, they realized what they were holding: Yamamoto's entire inspection itinerary. Takeoff time, landing points, escort composition, aircraft type, even the duration of each leg of the trip. It was as if the enemy had handed the United States a map of the precise location where the mastermind of their greatest humiliation would be, down to the minute. The room went silent. Even the analysts, accustomed to sensitive intelligence, understood the gravity of what they had just read. They also understood the classified nature of their achievement. If the Japanese ever discovered their codes were compromised, the Americans would lose a priceless advantage. Any use of the information had to be weighed against the risk of revealing its source. But the potential impact was enormous. Could the United States, by deliberate action, remove Japan's most prominent admiral from the war? Could they strike a psychological blow, damaging enough to ripple through the Japanese military command? The message made its way through layers of command until it reached President Franklin Roosevelt and Admiral Chester Nimitz. Roosevelt reportedly said, "Get Yamamoto." Whether he said those exact words or not, the sentiment was undeniable. This was an opportunity that might never come again. Yet even among American officers, hesitation lingered. The ethics of targeting an individual, even an enemy commander, were debated. Some wondered whether assassinating Yamamoto crossed the line. Others replied that Yamamoto was not a civilian leader, but an active-duty military officer inspecting frontline units in a combat zone. Beyond morality, there was another fear. What if the Japanese realized their codes were compromised? What if this triggered a complete overhaul of their encryption systems? For months, the U.S. advantage in code breaking had been held together by secrecy. One misstep could unravel it. But the weight of Pearl Harbor lingered heavily on American minds. Yamamoto symbolized Japan's wartime aggression. Removing him could sap morale among Japanese forces, weaken strategic planning, and perhaps tilt the balance further toward the United States. Ultimately, the decision was made. The Americans would attempt one of the most ambitious aerial interceptions in history. The operation was codenamed Vengeance, and that name captured the emotional undercurrent running beneath the strategic rationale. To accomplish the mission, the U.S. needed aircraft capable of flying hundreds of miles across open ocean, skimming low enough to avoid radar, and still possessing the speed to intercept Yamamoto's transport. The task fell to the U.S. Army Air Forces, specifically to the 339th Fighter Squadron, operating P-38 Lightnings from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The P-38 was chosen not for its firepower alone, but for its extraordinary range, extended further by drop tanks. Even so, the round trip would cover nearly 1,000 miles. The pilots were told only what was necessary. They would intercept an important Japanese target. They were not told who the target was. Only the mission planners, high command, and code breakers knew the truth. The planning was meticulous. The intercept point was chosen based on Yamamoto's exact flight schedule. The timing had to be perfect down to the minute. If the Americans arrived too early, they risked being detected. Too late, and Yamamoto would be gone. Navigating over vast stretches of featureless ocean demanded absolute precision, with no landmarks, no margin for error. Major John Mitchell, leading the mission, assigned roles to each pilot. 18 P-38s would make the journey. 4 of them, the Killer Group, would attack Yamamoto's transports. The rest formed a cover group to hold off any Japanese fighters. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the American pilots took off. At that very moment, Yamamoto and his staff were boarding 2 Mitsubishi GM-4B Betty bombers from Rabaul, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Yamamoto, the disciplined commander he was, insisted on punctuality. His reputation for timeliness would help to lead to his demise. As the P-38 skimmed the Pacific at barely 50 feet above the water, their engines thundered quietly against the waves. The pilots struggled to maintain formation while hugging the surface to avoid detection. Hours passed. Their fuel dwindled. Their flight path remained deliberately indirect to obscure any traceable pattern. The tension inside each cockpit grew heavier with each mile. Meanwhile, Yamamoto sat calmly in his bomber. He believed nothing could happen on this routine mission. Japan, after all, controlled much of the region. No one expected American fighters to appear hundreds of miles from their nearest major base. The admiral reportedly read a book during part of the flight, trusting in the Japanese assumption that their encrypted communications were secure. But by committing his itinerary to radio, he had unknowingly signed his death warrant. Approaching the intercept point, the American pilots began a gentle rise to altitude. They were early by only a few minutes. Mitchell ordered the squadron to circle once. As they completed the turn, one pilot suddenly spotted specks glinting in the distance. The Japanese formation emerged from the horizon exactly where and when the decoded message said it would. The Americans climbed. The Japanese escort saw them. The battle began instantly. The Zeros moved to intercept the P-38s, but the killer group dove straight for the two Betty bombers. Lieutenant Rex Barber and Captain Thomas Lanphier were among the first to make firing passes. The Betty carrying Yamamoto tried to evade, but its slower speed made escape impossible. Barber opened fire. His rounds